Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Hi, it is my great pleasure to welcome Tevi Troy. He is a best-selling presidential historian. He has written many books on the presidency, including his 2013 book called What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. But today we're here to talk about his latest book, Fight House: Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So before we start, I want to ask you something that I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
So far be it for me to speak for your entire generation, and I hate to classify an entire group just based on the years in which they were born. But for what I am seeing, I think there is a lack of an appreciation of the idea that you can disagree without being disagreeable. There seems to be a sense that if someone has different political perspectives, they can't be friends with someone who doesn't share their political perspectives. You see this in dating apps when people say Republicans only or Democrats only. And I think we're all healthier and better off if we can have conversations with people who disagree with us. We might even learn something. I have plenty of friends who are on the other side of the political aisle than I am. And I think I've learned a great deal from them, and they've been helpful to me throughout my life and throughout my career. So that would be my number one piece of advice to people of your generation. Just because someone doesn't agree with you politically doesn't mean you can't be friends with them and you can't learn from them.
That's such a good answer. I've seen that a lot, and it honestly kind of scares me. And I'm not sure. I mean, I've only been alive for 17 years, so I only know what I've seen really and what I've read, but it's not something that I see people talking about all the time. Like, oh, now it's changed from this to that, and now people aren't friends because of this. I don't know if it's a new thing, but it's kind of scary because for me, I understand that shouldn't be like super important in terms of if you can be friends with someone or not. But some people that I know are just so aggressive on that front, and I just don't understand. And I hope for them that it changes, that they realize that that's not how they should be assessing their friendship.
Yeah, amen to that. Let's hope that your blessing there or your call there becomes the way of the whole generation. Because I think something is lost when you just can't talk to people who don't agree with you.
So let's dive into the book. Something I really loved about this book was that from what I've seen and from what people seem to talk about a lot is that there was lots of dysfunction in the White House and there were lots of fights under President Trump. But in your book, you point out that it's not new. There have been rivalries and fights since like the beginning. I mean, especially you mentioned Hamilton in your introduction, and then you start with Truman and you talk about all the different rivalries and the different forms they take. So my first question to you is, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, you got at it in the setup to your question. At the beginning of the Trump years, there was all kinds of hand-wringing and screaming about, oh my gosh, there's fighting in the White House. This is unprecedented. We've never seen such a thing. Well, I'm a historian. When I hear the word unprecedented, I go to look for precedents. And so I specifically went to see if the assertion was true, that we've never seen fighting like this. And I found, even though I'm a presidential historian and I trained in presidential history and I've worked in the White House and I've thought about the presidency my whole life, I found that there's so much more infighting once you start to dig than I had ever imagined. And I found unbelievably great stories that I myself, who again, I'm a presidential historian, that I'd never heard before. And I said, I got to share these stories. They're too good not to share. And that's why I wrote the book.
And I'm glad you shared, because
Thanks.
I myself probably never would have found that information, and I wouldn't have even thought to look for it really. But Now that you wrote this book, I read it. I loved it. I thought it was so interesting.
Well, I appreciate that. I got to say, the people who've read this book really seem to like it. I've gotten very good feedback on it. And I think I have a method as an author, which is I try to write stuff that would never bore me. I don't want to be bored. And if I'm writing something that I find boring, then I'm just going to tear it up and start from scratch or do something else. So I really was thinking, how do I keep the pace going in this book? How do I keep the rhythm going so that you have these fun, interesting stories, but also that I make a larger point, which I am really trying to make about how a president can set up an administration so they actually get stuff done.
So, based on that, what do you think? I mean, you talk about how some people think that fights and rivalries within the staff is beneficial, and how some people completely disagree with that and think that if there is disagreement, that's just going to like be chaotic. Which side do you identify with more? What do you think?
Look, I don't think people have thought about this sufficiently. I think for the most part, people say, oh, fighting, that's bad. We don't like fighting. But they also don't like the groupthink that we were subjected to in the Vietnam War when Lyndon Johnson suppressed internal debate on the very important question of how to prosecute the Vietnam War. And so we kind of ended up with worse policy as a result. In fact, I say in the book, that there was a group of State Department aides who were skeptical, but they were so afraid of Johnson that they wouldn't even form a group. They called themselves the non-group, and they met at secret times so that Johnson wouldn't find out about it. That's not a way to have a full, robust debate inside administration of very important geopolitical and world historical choices.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense because I feel like you shouldn't have like outright, like, kind of, I don't even know how I would explain that. You can't have like everyone fighting all the time. It should be some sort of like you are free to disagree, but it's more of a constructive conversation instead of either secrets or the opposite, where it's just like arguing 100%.
What I try and lay out in the book is that there is a continuum. On one side of the continuum is where you have nothing but fighting and you have dysfunction and people backstabbing and leaking, and it's so problematic that people are afraid to say what they think for fear that someone will undercut them or leak on them or do something damaging to them. That is an impossible way to move forward in a White House. However, at the other end of the continuum is where everyone agrees so much that you don't hear outside voices, that you're not allowed to have internal dissent, and it's another form of dysfunction. So what you need to find is some kind of happy medium, a place where you can have robust internal debate, but at the same time know that everyone, once their voices are heard and the president makes a decision, then they move on, lock arms, like Karl Rove said, and I quote in the book, they lock arms and say, okay, the president has decided, we all had our say, and now we're all behind the policy. And that is the appropriate way to do things.
I think that's a good way to think about it and to explain it. I mean, that makes it make a lot of sense for me, thinking, well, both sides of the spectrum are dysfunctional, just different types of the same thing, which is kind of interesting. And I think more people need to understand stuff like that. But kind of, you mentioned how in Lyndon Johnson's White House, how there were lots of problems where people couldn't speak their minds. And that obviously wasn't how it was at the beginning. I mean, people talked within the cabinet, within the White House, all of that. So, can you give us a short history of how the office of the president has evolved from the time Washington was president to when Truman was president?
Yeah, so in the days before and the years before Truman was president, and starting from Washington on, really through FDR, through Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you had a president, and when the president wanted aides, the aides for the president were basically the cabinet secretaries. Maybe there was an undersecretary in some departments. But for the most part, you did not have a White House staff like we see it today. In the Roosevelt administration, as government started to grow, there was a sense that there was too much going on for the president to have a handle on just with the help of his cabinet secretaries. And so this commission called the Brownlow Commission issued a report that famously said, the president needs help. And the help should come, it said, via a series of aides with a, quote, passion for anonymity. And that is really the origin of the White House staff. The White House staff, as we know it today, basically comes out of that report and that idea. And so it begins under Roosevelt. Truman, with whom I start the book, is the first president to enter the presidency with a White House staff. And so the whole question of infighting, I just argue, has a different dynamic post-Truman than it did in the days when the cabinet secretaries were the chief aides to the president. The other thing is that once you had White House staffers who might be in charge of foreign policy or economic policy, they are almost by definition going to run at odds or run afoul of the cabinet secretaries, or let's say the Treasury Secretary, the State Department head, the Secretary of State, who believe that they should be the lead person on those issues. And indeed, they are legislatively. But in fact, the National Security Advisor sits next to the president. The National Economic Advisor sits next to the president, and in that way can have more influence over decisions, which is often a frustration by these cabinet secretaries. And that's why the most frequent fight that I talk about in Fight House is between the National Security Advisor, whoever he or she might be, and the Secretary of State, whoever he or she might be. It's not necessarily personality driven, it's positionally driven. It's based on the fact that the Secretary of State thinks they should run foreign policy, and they often, as a result, run into conflict with the National Security Advisor, who is next to the president and advising him on foreign policy.
And what does the White House look like today? How is that different from, well, I don't know, let's say Washington and then Truman and now?
Well, you didn't really have a White House with staff quarters back in the Washington days. In fact, Washington didn't even work in the White House. That doesn't come until the Capitol moves to D.C. around 1800, and then you do have a White House, but it does burn down. And so then you have a White House for the first century that is a residence for the president, but it doesn't really have room for staff. Teddy Roosevelt realized that it's not big enough, and he built what's now known as the West Wing. Before that, all staff was in the East, the Eisenhower Executive Building or the East Executive Building, and that at one point held the departments of Defense, or what was called Department of War, and the Department of the Navy. I mean, it was a huge building, and right now the Pentagon has those offices. So this one building on 17th Street really had to have all the staff for running the entire military. Now that obviously is an impossible standard. So under Teddy Roosevelt, you get the West Wing, and then you start to have this idea of White House aides that becomes formalized under Franklin Roosevelt. And so Truman does have some aides, but he also doesn't have the kind of instantaneous communication we have. So there are times I talk about in the book where national security advisors use the fact that they controlled the paper, and the paper was in front of the president or in the White House, and the Secretary of State didn't have time to run over to the White House to double check the memos and make sure that he was on board with them. Now with email and secure communications, it's a lot easier to do. So I think you just have kind of a shrinking of distances as a result of communications, even as the president's influence expands as a result of the growth of both government and the size of the staff that he has before him.
Your book starts with a chapter on after the introduction, with a chapter on both Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Why did you put them together in a chapter?
That's a really good question, and I got to say I've done a bunch of interviews on the book. You're the first person to ask it. I argue that Truman and Eisenhower were very similar in their approach. They had a kind of button-down approach. They didn't really want a lot of infighting. It was before White House aides became famous, and so the real shift happens in Kennedy once you start to have famous White House aides. And I just thought the similarities were so great that I wanted to combine them. The White House, in some ways, the White House staff was created by the Brownlow Commission, as I said earlier, but in other ways, the White House staff, as we know it today, of these kind of glamorous people who go on to famous jobs afterwards, really started with the Kennedy administration. So I just thought everything before Kennedy was just a little different, and that's why I thought it was appropriate to combine them.
That makes sense. It's kind of like a middle period, and then I like that. So what are the key factors that led to the change in the institution that is the White House?
Well, first of all, was the advent of television and kind of glamour. I mean, you started to have a White House aide could be recognizable because he appeared on television, and suddenly people know who he is. Second of all, John F. Kennedy brought in relatively famous people to serve as his White House advisors, most famously Arthur Schlesinger, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian before he ever joined the administration, probably the best known historian in America at the time. And then he also had Ted Sorensen, who was really famous as a result of his work with Kennedy, but still was relatively well known. He ghost wrote Kennedy's famous book that also won the Pulitzer Prize in the 1950s. And and there was so much glamour around Kennedy that the people around Kennedy were just sort of became known. So the fame that came with the initial wave of Kennedy aides, I think, was part of the shift in the White House to make people realize that suddenly this job is not only a job where you get to serve the country, but it's also a potential springboard to success and to great fame after an administration. And obviously, we've had many, many White House aides who went on and became much more famous after, like George Stephanopoulos, for example, who became an ABC News commentator after serving the Clinton administration, or Peggy Noonan, who was a White House speechwriter under Reagan and is now a Wall Street Journal columnist. So you have the sense that if I blow this, it could really have a negative impact on my career. But if I thrive in my time in the White House, it really is a springboard to great fame and potentially great fortune.
Some interesting factors. In your book, you talk about some of the conflicts being the product of how cabinet heads butt heads with each other and with White House staffers. You talk in particular about the huge conflicts during the Kennedy presidency between LBJ, who was the vice president, and Robert Bobby Kennedy, who was Kennedy's brother. And these two guys, they really disliked each other.
Yeah.
Can you tell us why, and can you tell us what happened between the two of them?
Well, these two guys disliked each other from the moment they met. I tell the story in the book of when Kennedy, Robert F., not John, was a Senate aide in the 1950s. Lyndon Johnson, who was the Senate Majority Leader, encounters him and wants to shake his hand. And Kennedy doesn't think much of Johnson, doesn't stand up and won't shake his hand. Johnson looms over Kennedy for the longest and most uncomfortable time until Kennedy finally realizes that he has no choice and he gets up and shakes Johnson's hand. They hated each other from that minute. And as Kennedy's father once said, "Bobby's my boy. When he hates you, you stay hated." And Johnson sure stayed hated, and it was mutual. But there's an interesting dynamic at play in that Johnson enters the White House as vice president, but not someone who really has a lot of power as vice president because the Kennedy team didn't think much of him. Robert F. Kennedy is the attorney general to his brother, the only time you've ever had an arrangement like that. And Robert F. Kennedy is incredibly powerful in the White House, far more than an attorney general would typically be. But then in 1963, John F. Kennedy is tragically assassinated in Dallas. And as a result, suddenly Lyndon Johnson is catapulted to power, and he becomes not only president, but a very powerful president. And Robert F. Kennedy suddenly becomes a very non-powerful or impotent attorney general. And the two men just don't get along. Robert F. Kennedy eventually leaves the administration, and then he runs for Senate in New York in 1964, becomes a senator from where he torments Johnson. And so the two men have this hatred that continues through the different levels of status that they have throughout the career and actually tracks them until the end of Robert F. Kennedy's life when he's running to replace Johnson as president, and he dies after the California primary in 1968, murdered by Sirhan Sirhan.
I can't imagine what would have happened if the Kennedy presidency had lasted 8 years, because I mean, it seemed like a super explosive, like, dynamic, and I don't know. I can't help but wonder how long he stood waiting for the handshake. I can just imagine it being like 5 to 10 minutes, and it probably wasn't that
It
long,
probably
but
wasn't, but it seemed that long, right?
I don't know. I just kept laughing because that's just what I was thinking about, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that if that happened to me today, I would just feel so uncomfortable." I also don't think that it would take me that long to shake someone's hand, but I don't know. It's just kind of silly to think about and just to imagine because we don't have like a picture of them, of one looming over the other, but it's just an interesting thing to think about. Um, so, can you give us examples of a few of the other fights that have led full grown adults to fight and not talk with each other anymore?
Yeah, I kind of love that not talking. So I tell a story in the Truman administration of the fight over uh, the 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 state of Israel and whether the United States should recognize it. Obviously, today Israel is a very close ally of the United States, and it just seems odd that we would have even wondered whether to recognize Israel. But it was a debate then. And Secretary of State George Marshall, whom Truman actually revered, was against recognizing Israel. But Truman wanted to hear the other side, so he tasked Clark Clifford, who at the time was a junior White House aide, later became the Secretary of Defense under Johnson, but he was a relative unknown at the time. And Truman tasks Clifford to make the case for recognizing Israel in front of Marshall and in front of Truman. And not only does Clifford do this, but he does it quite successfully, and Truman sides with the junior aide Clifford over the Secretary of State Marshall. Marshall is so mad that he loses this encounter that he never again speaks to Clifford or, and this is crazy, utters his name for the rest of his life. Talk about carrying a grudge. So yeah, I mean, sometimes people take these fights very seriously, and they linger long after the people leave the White House.
And there are a lot of examples in the book also of where even when you don't see the fight like flat out, you kind of can pick up on clues, like someone just refusing to mention someone else's name for the rest of their lives in their memoirs, in books, in articles, in quotes. It's just so, I don't even know. I would say part of me really wants to laugh, but part of me is also like, that's kind of sad because that's the White House. So I'm like conflicted as to how I should react.
Yeah, it might go contrary to the advice I gave about your generation. It seems like there have been other people throughout history who have taken this problematic approach where they can't get past their political differences and they bring it into the realm of the personal. But I would argue that people like Clifford and Marshall were anomalous, and I would say that most of these fights don't end in this kind of systemic long-term hatred. And I point out in the book there was a frequent disagreements between Ed Meese and Jim Baker. Ed Meese was the person who thought he'd be chief of staff under Ronald Reagan. Jim Baker got the job, and they did clash while the two of them were both working in the White House. But they uh, but they had correct relations with each other face to face, even though Baker did leak negative things about Meese to the press and had a, a dismissive nickname for Meese, who was a little overweight, and he called him Poppin' Fresh the Doughboy. Uh, but but even though they had these disagreements in the White House, I would say they did not end up as enemies. And in fact, later on, when Baker is the head of what's known as the Iraq Study Group, which when the Iraq War is not going well, he heads this bipartisan group to try and figure out a way to improve the policies and the approach. And there's a hole on the committee because Rudy Giuliani, who is now also back in the news these days, is appointed to the committee, but he doesn't show up for the meetings. So they need to get another Republican in there. And Baker, again, who was an enemy of Meese in the White House, or at least a rival of Meese in the White House, picks Meese to join this Iraq study group. And Meese, patriot to the end, he agrees to join. He doesn't say, oh, well, Baker's doing it, I'm not going to do it. And Baker doesn't say, oh, I'm not going to get that guy Meese. So Baker saw the right person for the job, and he picked him, and they worked together again then. So again, I think that's a better approach to get past these disagreements while you're in there and recognize that they were based on what was going on at the time and are not necessarily things that should really uh, follow you for the rest of your life.
And along that same kind of wavelength, that idea, your book shows that different presidents have different styles of management. What do you think are the ones that are most conducive to conflicts and why?
Well, I think I lay out the three levers that presidents have in their control if they want to limit infighting. Number one is ideological disagreement. If you have a team that is ideologically aligned, you're going to have less infighting. Number two is a process, and by that I mean a decision-making process where everyone gets a chance to say their piece, and if they have their, if it doesn't go their way, at least they felt like they had their say. And then number three is presidential tolerance. The current president has shown tolerance for infighting, has even said, "I like conflict." But other presidents, like Obama, said, I don't want to see this kind of stuff. And he was famously known as No Drama Obama. So I think presidents can control it to some degree. I don't think they can completely eliminate it, but I think they can control it to some degree. And sometimes you have a president who can't control it for reasons that I think are a mark in their benefit. So Jerry Ford, for example, everybody said what a nice guy he was, and apparently he was. But he was unable to control the constant infighting in the Ford White House. And in fact, the Ford White House was the most, if not or one of the most contentious White Houses I look at in Fight House. And it was in part due to the fact that Ford was just too nice a guy to address the problem.
So, kind of being too, I don't even have a word for that. Well, there is a word for that. It just slipped my mind. Anyways, in the chapter about the Truman White House, you write that, quote, the Truman staff was no freer than any other from ordinary tendencies toward turf battle, personality conflicts, and backbiting. Such episodes were minimal, unquote. You explain that it's because he loathed conflicts. And another president that also had this similar view towards conflict was Obama. Your chapter about the Obama White House is called Conflicts in the Era of No Drama
No drama.
Obama,
Yeah.
which I don't know. I just, for some reason, the way it rhymes just made me laugh.
Yeah.
You write, quote, there was no Baker versus Meese, no Kissinger versus Rogers, no Brzezinski versus Vance, let alone anything even close to LBJ versus RFK, end quote. Yet, there were some great tensions, and to my surprise, many of the dramas kind of centered around gender and about female senior officials feeling diced by male counterparts. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Sure. I thought the gender tension was very interesting in the Obama White House, and something that I don't think I picked up on during the administration. It's only after the administration ended, when you had access to more of the memoirs and the records, that suddenly you see what was going on. And so there was a sense among the women in the Obama White House that they needed to stick together, and sometimes they stuck together at the expense of the men. And there are certain men who didn't get jobs that they thought they were going to get because the Obama White House was trying to fill certain jobs with women, not necessarily the best person for the job, but they said specifically a woman has to get this job. And sometimes people were put out by that. And then also I tell the story of Alyssa Mastromonaco, who was relatively young looking, but she was a pretty senior person on the Obama transition. She sees Larry Summers, who's kind of a pretty legendary economic advisor in Democratic circles. And she's all moon-eyed about seeing the famous Larry Summers until he turns around and asks her to get him a Diet Coke. After which she kind of shoots dagger eyes at him and resolves to roll her eyes at him anytime he speaks for the rest of the administration. So they eventually reconciled, which is interesting, and I laid that out in the book. But she clearly had a gender-based disagreement with him, or a gender-based reason for disliking him, and so I think that showed up.
Do you think that the reason why it was more gender related was just because of just because the administration said we have to fill this position with a woman, this position, this blah blah blah?
I think that doesn't help. The story I specifically talk about is Dan Pfeiffer, who thought he was going to be the communications director in the Obama White House, and that was the job he had in the campaign. And it ended up that a woman got the job who had not even worked on the Obama campaign and had even backed Hillary Clinton. And so he was pretty mad about that. And he talks in his memoir about how Obama had all these great rules about not facilitating conflict and trying to avoid conflict. And once he got passed over for his job, he kind of went out of his way and tried to undercut this woman who got the job over him. So I think that feeling like you were aggrieved, like you didn't get something that you should have, does I think sometimes lead to not only alienation but also to misbehavior.
So we have a new president-elect, Biden. If you had any advice to him about how to organize his White House staff in order to minimize explosive conflict or fear of speaking out, what would you advise?
Well, I think about the three levers. Number one, try and have an ideologically aligned staff to the extent you can. Make sure you have a fair process so people feel like they can say their piece, even if they don't always win. And number three, make it clear that you don't want to see this kind of stuff, that you have little tolerance for this kind of behavior, and that you guys need to put the country first and not your own personal predilections above the country's interests. So I think make those three things clear at the outset, and I think then you'll probably be in better shape than you would be if you don't make those things clear at the beginning.
So, kind of on the idea of chief of staff, because this is something that I've been kind of interested in, but have just gotten into really. So the first chief of staff was hired under Eisenhower. Can you tell us about give us a short history about the chief of staff of the White House? And I mean, it wasn't obvious that the position would stick from the beginning. That's what the impression that I've gotten. So,
well, not only was it not obvious, but it didn't stick. Right? Some administrations had it and some didn't. Eisenhower has a chief of staff, Sherman Adams, who gets into some ethical trouble. Chief of staff is a position that comes from the military, and Eisenhower was famously a general. When John F. Kennedy comes in, he doesn't have a chief of staff, and neither does Lyndon Johnson. But then when Richard Nixon brings the Republicans back, he does return with the chief of staff. But the chief of staff he picks, H.R. Haldeman, goes to jail as a result of the Watergate scandal and is seen as a little too imperious. So when Ford comes in, he has Donald Rumsfeld technically as the chief of staff, but he doesn't even call him chief of staff. He calls him staff coordinator. And then later, when Jimmy Carter takes over, he also doesn't have a chief of staff initially until he realizes that the administration is insufficiently focused, I would say, and has too many moments of lack of clarity and problems as a result of not having a chief of staff. So he does go with the chief of staff, and then Reagan follows up with the chief of staff, and then I think from Reagan on, you've had that position ever since. So it was a close run thing. It went back and forth for a while, but I think it was really when Carter realized that despite the fact that he disliked the Ford and Nixon administrations, he did need someone to be in charge of the staff. And then so Carter makes that decision, and I think the subsequent presidents followed. And then it also helps that Ronald Reagan had James Baker, who was probably the best chief of staff ever and the most successful chief of staff ever. And by most successful, I lay out the three criteria, which are number one, successfully serves an administration, gets it reelected. Number two, avoids scandal and doesn't have any scandal himself. And number three, kind of leaves on his own terms as opposed to getting fired because he either angered the president or alienated the president or made a mistake.
You talk about how different chief of staff, yeah, how their different styles had influences on the way that the presidents governed and their style. Some presidents like to have their chief of staff act as gatekeepers and have a more centralized White House, but others would rather have a decentralized White House where the chief of staff assists mainly the president, but everyone in the White House has access to him. How did different styles of chiefs of staff impact the conflicts in the White House?
Yeah, look, if you give the chief of staff authority over the staff, for the most part, they should be able to manage things and control conflict. However, sometimes chiefs of staff want to kind of get in the mix a little bit too much themselves. Here I'm thinking of John Sununu in the George H.W. Bush administration. And he and Dick Darman, who was the head of OMB, both very smart guys, but too smart perhaps, because one bragged about his IQ scores, the other bragged about his SAT scores. And the two of them kind of suppressed any type of dissent in the Bush White House and even suppressed new and interesting ideas from coming up through the pipeline. And so Sununu himself got involved in the conflicts in a way that I don't think a chief of staff should have, and he did not pass those three tests I laid out. He did get involved in a scandal about misuse of government travel resources. He His president did not get reelected, and he did not leave of his own volition, although he had to be told multiple times that the president wanted him to go before he agreed to leave.
Yeah, that doesn't sound great.
It wasn't.
So,
But he was a
my,
smart guy, right? He was a clearly smart guy. And Bush also probably wouldn't have been president without him, given how much help he provided in the New Hampshire primary. He was a former governor of New Hampshire.
so I mean, some positives and some negatives.
Yeah.
Finally, my final question to you is: what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Yeah, I guess I would say I did not think I was going to get married. I was not so into that, and just didn't think that was going to be my pathway. And obviously, I did do that, and my wife and I have been married for 20 years. I have four wonderful kids, and just sometimes you think something at one stage in your life, and then sometimes you realize that you're better off going in a different direction.
That is interesting. That's kind of cool. I mean, I don't know. I Everyone my age feels like they have a very definite idea of where they're going in the future and what their familial life is going to look like. Also their professional lives. And I'm like, I
Yeah,
have
I think they're all
no
wrong. Let me just say that. Anything you think at age, are you 17, I believe?
Yeah.
So anything you think at 17 is it's just not gonna play out that way. Things, I was living in New York, and and just religiously I was different, politically I was different. Never occurred to me that I'd work in the White House or be a senior appointed official in the United States government or write books when I was 17, and I've done all those things. So just don't make too many plans based on what you think when you're 17. Is my advice.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't. I mean, that's not I don't I do and I don't. Like I do, but I know fully well that it will not happen the way I think it will happen. But there are a lot of people, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to be crushed. And I'm like, prepare to be crushed, man. Sorry.
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, there are disappointments in life. There are jobs I didn't get, and there are books I tried to write that no publisher wanted, or there's articles that I tried to pitch that were not accepted. I mean, that happens. It's natural. But the key thing in life is not whether you ever suffer disappointment, but how you react to the disappointments. I don't want to resort to the Rocky movies, but what they say there is life is not about how hard you get punched, but whether you can get up again afterwards and whether you do.
Which is generally, I don't know, that's a good thing to hear. It's good advice. Well, thank you so much for being on my podcast and talking to me about this book. I have been recommending it to people left and right. I think it's so important for people to understand this sort of thing, and I knew I definitely didn't understand it. So, I don't
Great.
know. It's very interesting. So, thank you so much again, and yeah.
Sure. Well, your next recommendation should be to your mom that she should write a column on the book because she and I have been talking about it. So would love to see that. And I think it's great that you're getting into podcasting, and there's all kinds of great possibilities in this great country. I know that if you read the newspapers, you think everything's down and miserable, but it's just not the case. And I think there's a lot of potential. And look, just the way we're talking right now over my computer, and you're recording it and going to issue a podcast, it's just something I couldn't have imagined when I was 17 years old. The technology didn't exist, and I didn't even know that the technology would exist. So I think we've made a lot of progress in not that many decades, and I think there's more progress to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely looking up to the future. I'm very excited. So,
Great.
thank you again.